Welcome, everyone, to another session of our Poets Talk Politics show or series, I guess. Not a show, We don't want to. We don't want to sound too pompous. Series that we've been running here at the Comparative Literature Institute of the University of Porto for more than 2 years now. So and one of the first things I wanted to say today was that there's a bunch of videos that we've done in the last couple of months that haven't been uploaded onto YouTube yet, right? So we we did a video with Linh Dinh, a poet from Vietnam, 3 months ago, I believe, or 4 months ago. Did a video of Vanessa Place. We talked to Felipe Cusan from Chile. And lastly, last month we spoke with Steve Zoltansky, so post-conceptualist poet here from the States. But that session was not recorded because Steve did not want to, have a recording online. So we will, provide folks with a transcript whenever I have time to do it. It's a very time-consuming thing to do. But yeah, just so you know that whoever's watching, so that those things are the the Vanessa Place and the Felipe Cusan videos are still on the Institute's page, right? If you scroll down for a while, you'll find them eventually, but they'll all be on YouTube, and including this session that's being live streamed now. So I'd like to welcome Dubravka Djurić to this session that we're doing today about her book, The Politics of Hope After the War. I'll just go around and introduce everyone. So we have on the panel two of my current graduate students, Rita Mota and Ezra Félix, who are, so they're both, as I said, both students in the master's program in literary, cultural, and interartistic studies. And they are both visual artists, right? So let me pull up their bios over here. So let's see. So Rita, right? Rita Mota is an illustrator, and she also draws or makes comic books, right? She has an interest in small press publishing and transgressive publications. Also interested in body horror and monsters, and she's generally interested in cultural studies and queer theory. Then, so that's Rita. And Rita, oh, by the way, Rita's work, right? If you're interested, her work is I think she mostly publishes stuff on Instagram, right? We were talking about it, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I don't have an artist page yet." So
Yeah.
but it's all on Instagram. If you're interested, that's where her work is being displayed currently. And then Ezra Felix is an artist. They work in photography, video, and have an interest in self-publishing zines, right? So again, like small press publishing. They are interested in cinema, also body horror. So that we have a very, they're sisters. They're uh, also interested in body horror, queer theory, disability studies, and Greek tragedy. And Ezra's work is available, right, for whoever's interested on their artist's page, which I believe if they just type your name on Google, they'll find you, Ezra, right? But the website is Ezra Félix dot cargo dot site. Right. So that's the that's the website. And you know, if you're interested, just ask me, or ask Ezra directly, and they'll tell you where to go. And then finally, our guest of honor, Dubravka uh, Djurić was born in Dubrovnik, now in Croatia. I'm reading the bio from the book, Dubravka. She is a poet, a critic, and professor at the Faculty for Media and Communication in Belgrade. She received her PhD in literary theory from the Faculty of Philosophy in Novi Sad. And from 2015 to 2022, she was president of the Serbian Association for Anglo-American Studies. She has published numerous books of criticism and studies of poetry and art. Her poetry has been translated into English, Polish, Italian, Bulgarian, Macedonian, Slovenian, Albanian, and Hungarian, not Portuguese. So
No.
there's a clearly,
Maybe
clearly,
this will be
right.
the initial call for this.
Yes. So if anyone, if anyone's, out there wants to do it, so here's the opportunity, right? Including myself, of course, She lives in Belgrade with her husband, Miško Suvakovic. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that, so maybe if you'd
Šuvaković.
like,
Šuvaković.
like to correct me. So welcome, Dubravka. And so Dubravka is going to read a couple of poems for us before we start the discussion, I believe. So, just welcome.
Uh,
Thank you for
Thank you
being here.
very much. Thank you for having me in this program, and I'm very honored. And I will start to first. I want to just say that Biljana Obradović, Serbian American poet, did this huge book of selected poems of mine, and she did it really great. And I'm very grateful to poet James Sherry, who is a publisher at Roth Books, and for Charles Bernstein. They all were very supportive, and I want to thank them. And I will start with one relatively small portion of one very long poem. And it is written in 1907, and the most of the poems here are implicitly or with many references refer to the war in former Yugoslavia in 90s. So this poem actually expresses a way that I feel very bad at that time because everything was happening. And while we doing this book, Biljana and I were sharing the feeling that it is very much unfortunately, in resonance with current world affair with so many wars. So the poem is called Descent. We descend the stairs. Who are we? Mysterious being, the thought come to me and blood freezes in veins. Secretly and publicly, rumors circulate from mouth to mouth. Stories are being told. Fogs have scattered over compartments. Someone is shaking out their rugs and annoys me. Someone is eating. Someone is watching TV. Someone is planning heinous crimes. Someone's month is filled with stories. The clouds of gossip filled up from moment to moment. That mad woman doesn't know what she's doing. That mad man is destroying our communal lives. Oh, Cassandra, it is a reference to the Venezuela TV soap, which was very popular at the time. Our hope, our faith remains in you. You are so beautiful, so young, the personification of goodness and beauty, of all lost post-communist hope. Commanders, execution, all that freedom will turn into gold. Freedom in gold, like magnesium, a toxic substance which slides down the nation's body, stylish, disguised as angels who come down from the heaven to confuse the mind of chicken's head in the breaded brains with fish roe. I sit in a room and observe the world through the window. I hug small, hungry rats as if they are the most refined beings of new planets. After all ruins, after all successes, after all diseases in hospital beds, filled hospital cots, patients in groups of 2, 3, 5, 10, like small rats in their holes of post-communist heaven. That is a small portion of a long poem. So I think maybe this could be interesting for the beginning. I don't hear you. I don't hear you for some reason.
I muted. Uh, no, I was saying, Dubravka, that I had flagged this poem, Descent, from, I believe, the from All Over, right? This is a collection from that covers a you know, a period of work from 1996 to 2004, right? So no, then the reason I have flagged this was because I thought, I mean, I'm not going to refer to the part that you read, but a little further ahead in the poem, right? You say that, so on page, I mean, for whoever, I mean, I don't know, whoever bought the book, you know, on page 106, you say, you know, the benefits of this paradise have yet to be discovered, but have been left by the wayside after so many years of beauty, right? And it seems to me that this poem is also about like getting back to the basics, right? But also getting back to the basics of, you know, life without war, right? But also it has this idea that I think you explore in a number of the poems, including more recent poetry, right? Of nostalgia, right? Nostalgia for and that's what I wanted to ask you about, right? Nostalgia for pre-war Yugoslavia, right? Pre-war socialist Yugoslavia. And, you know, I wanted to hear your, I guess, opinion about whether you think that was, you know, let's say a more utopian, more inclusive period of your um, country's history that you sort of look back to with nostalgia, because you criticize in one of the last poems in the book, right? One of the new poems, you sort of bring up this issue of like, you know, should we look at this period with nostalgia or not, right? Is it the right thing to do, right? Like Tito's socialist government, which at least in my understanding, for all the flaws that it had, it was nonetheless more inclusive, you know, in terms of like how all of the ethnicities that Yugoslavia sort of, you know, encompassed were, you know, more cohesively, I guess, um, included in the country's socialist project, right? So I don't know. Just let me know whether you think that this is, you know, I guess something that you in Serbia look back to as a, you know, better period in history, or not. I don't know. I mean, that's
I think it's a really complex question, and I will just say that the poems, there is two poems titled Nostalgia, and the title comes because at the time when I wrote some of these poems, I was in Ljubljana. My husband Miško Šovaković teaches there, and we spent a month, and it is a very bad period of the war, and what is interesting, at the center, downtown of Ljubljana, there was a coffee bar called Nostalgia, and whole the bar was arranged like with the pictures, photos, and everyday things. For example, I don't know, furniture or everyday how to say, different things that you use in everyday life in your home, for example. And because in Slovenia was not the war, many of us come to Slovenia, and everybody from different parts of former Yugoslavia could came to Ljubljana. At that time, we ended at this coffee bar Nostalgia. It was a kind of, I don't know, place of gathering of all of us from the country that were disappearing in front of us in the war. I also have to say that I belong to the generation that are very much critical towards socialism. A few days ago, I told the story, for example, I'm not sure, was it in 90, that my professor from comparative literature, it was just before the war were starting in Yugoslavia, 1991, I could not remember. And they invited all of us, former students, and from different generation, and we gathered in one classroom, and some of our professors were there, and they were speaking, and we are all very exciting. And one of our professors put the photo of Tito down, and we all applaud. It was a symbolic, yes, it is the end of communism. Yugoslavia was a multicultural country, which was very positive, and every war, actually with the war you have ethnic cleansing. Every country that entered the war actually how to say, expel all other which are not our people. So we have a transition from multicultural to monocultural state. And there is function of the symbolic function of Yugoslavia for last 20, at least 20 or 30 years, that many people have felt nostalgic, even those young people who was born much later. And this has a function as a critical stance toward the contemporary state of affair in this new country. Of course, it is a capitalism with this brutal economy that is not just in this part of the world, but globally. And the big problem is that is become mostly monocultural society, which is, I think, not good. And but in most of these countries, official, which is majority of people, an official state looking at Yugoslavia is very negative. So if you say something good about Yugoslavia, you are viewed as somebody who is I don't know, maybe our enemy. You are not seeing that was a bad thing. And then, so many, for example, many people who are very critical about the state of affairs and have some very positive attitudes toward Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia. Many of this kind of people, when they want to speak about former Yugoslavia, or even many of us are dealing with contemporary literature or artistic practice in all part or most part of former Yugoslavia, which is also a kind of political, cultural political statement. But many, not all, but many of such a people have how to say, they want to say what they felt obliged to say. I'm not Yugo-nostalgic. Because when you say I'm not Yugo-nostalgic, it means that I know it was not perfect country or it was bad country, but etc. So there are many different political issues toward what was Yugoslavia, or it is very interesting to see what is now Yugoslavia for different kind of political, social groups in these new countries. But in this, many of the poems in this book, including, I think, when you say, I forget in which poem I mentioned, a new poem, Nostalgia, because I suppose I will also referring to some memories or some cultural facts or some other people who have or say something about the state of affairs in socialist Yugoslavia. I hope that I try to map that the situation is very complex.
Right. No, the poem in which you use that very term, right, that you just mentioned, Yugo nostalgia, right, is my love of narrative is satisfied by television series.
Which page is it?
It's on page 202.
I didn't see first. What is the number? I didn't hear well.
202.
202. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No. But again, like I think you know your response was clear as to how people position themselves again, or have a very ambiguous, I guess, relationship towards Yugoslavia as yeah, as you said, like it was a bad it was a dictatorship.
But it was soft. It was a soft kind of communism, so we could travel. Right. We were fascinated with American poetry. We have, I think, I conducted one investigation of the reception of American poetry in former Yugoslavia through anthologies. And the first anthology was published in Zagreb, in socialist Croatia, in 52. I suppose that maybe it is the first anthology of American poetry published in one socialist country. I think from 52 till last year, there was at least 25 anthologies of American poetry. And most of them were published in socialist Serbia or post-socialist Serbia. So it's very interesting phenomenon because we were open toward West, and especially toward American culture in different ways, including poetry.
Right. Yeah. I don't know, guys. Do you wanna maybe Rita can go first? I don't know.
Yeah, I have a question that I think connects to what you were saying. I'm curious because in your work, I was reading the preface to the book, and I also read some interviews where you mention influence from American language poets from the 60s and 70s, such as Bernstein. And I was curious as to how exactly how did they get to you? How did you find them? Because you were just saying that other people around you were also reading them. Did you study them in school? How did that happen?
When I studied comparative literature from the beginning of 80s till mid 80s, many, for example, I studied comparative literature, and the impact of English was such a way that at the end, when one moment in the last 10 years, thinking about myself and many of my colleagues, most of us become American study scholars, some English study scholar, but most of us are dealing with American literature. And I suppose I laughing with myself when I said, if I am student in this period, I suppose that I will decide to study Russian, because I want to say that your cultural environment actually make you feel and make some decisions that are in the atmosphere of your country you're living in. But Yugoslavia, for example, beat poetry was so much translated, and it goes from the beginning of 60s. And for example, Ginsberg had a very strong connection with different poets from Yugoslavia, and especially from Serbia, from Belgrade, and so much translations of beat poets, especially, of course, of Allen Ginsberg. And I was connected. I was never interested in beat poets. In my studying at my faculty, I very much studied T.S. Eliot, because T.S. Eliot was the most important poet after Second World War. After Second World War, social realism was, how to say, in Yugoslavia, because of departure from Soviet Union and Soviet bloc, the socialist realism lasted very short period of time. And translating T.S. Eliot, he was translated by the poets born in 20s, that were after 50s, were, how to say, relatively young people who want to grab again ideas of modernism in poetry, and T.S. Eliot was very important. And I even translated 2 of his texts and read his work, because almost everything was translated in Serbo-Croatian. But on the other side, I was connected with Belgrade Conceptual Group 143, and they were all avant-garde, and they told me, you should, for example, read Thomas Šalamun, and Thomas Šalamun was important poet who was connected with famous Oko group, Slovenian conceptual art. And in 87, Belgrade prose poet and very important translator of American literature, prose, but also poetry. His name is David Al-Bahari. He was a Belgrade Jew, and he is translated in different languages, including English. In America, published some books. In one Belgrade magazine called Pismo, he wrote a small note about Ron Seligman anthology in the American Tree. And because in Yugoslavia experimental poetry almost disappeared at the time, I was in a very unpleasant situation. And when I read this review, I said, oh, this must be something that could be interesting for me. And I managed to bought several books. And in 88, I start translating it. I will say I call my English at that time socialist English, at least in Serbia, we didn't pay so much attention that you have to know languages. So I start learning English during I have it from primary school, but I start seriously to study it at my faculty. And many of my professors said, this is bad translation, this is bad translation. And I said, when they publish so many bad translation, I will start to translate from English. I have two British poetry, but with my level of language, I could not translate it. And I have two anthologies of American poetry. One of them was Postmoderns, which is re-edition of Donald Allen's famous New American poetry. And then I start translating, and of course I have some friends who knows better English than me, and they help me, and that's how I start translating. And in '89, in Belgrade magazine Delo, we managed to edit one issue called American Poetics. So there was two important poets originally from Sarajevo, Slobodan Blagojević, who was editor-in-chief, and his life partner Hamdija Demirović. They both were translator of American poetry and both poets, and they accepted. And then my proposal that we should have an issue, and most of the poets were presented with the poetics and with the poetry. And I sent it to Segway Foundation, and Charles Bernstein respond. And then I sent him this issue, and he gave me so many addresses that I sent to different people. And at that moment, my fascination with language poetry began. And I think that whole 90s and maybe beginning of 2000, I translate so much of language poets. I focus on them, and they were, for me, attractive because they have poetics and also theory. So I translate a lot of also their text, and it was a kind of fascination. And at that moment from 90s, when I start translating language poets, I connected my work with my translations. So because my theory is that you are in so-called small culture, or culture with a smaller language, you have to know in deep some, I will say, a culture with the language that is much spoken and which are influential at the global level with the poetic model. So I connected my work consciously with first of all, American poetry. So I suppose that this kind of poetry that I'm writing, it is in a global view, could be said that it belongs to the model of language poetry as a global movement, I would say. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. I have a little follow-up question. Is that okay? I'm just curious because you mentioned your various translations at the time. I'm just curious, were there a lot of funds? Was the government funding translations? Was the government funding the arts? Was there funding for that specifically?
In socialism, people told me that there was a period when they publish a book as authors or publish translation, and they could buy a house or a car. So it is they give money, but how time passes, less and less money were given. And I think that when I think in 90s, from time to time I would got some money, but Usually I didn't got paid, but I was so fascinated, and I was happy that some of the editors wanted to publish a lot of this very hard kind of a poetry.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Ezra, before we just move to you, let me just say something that I think is relevant, apropos of language poetry and how sort of that it's true that as you were saying, Dubravka, uh, that there was like a cosmopolitan, let's say, or a global impetus behind language poetry that we don't have today, let's say, in like, I mean, the kids know, I mean, I keep showing them in my class, right? I keep showing them poets that I particularly like a lot, right? Like Rob Fitterman, who's been on the show, for example, right? But they're not really, this new generation of American poets does not really have the same hunger, I guess, for connecting with poets from other cultures or from other places. And I would say, right, like that it's not just a language poetry thing. It's funny that when we started reading your book, right, one of the things that Rita immediately told me was like, what is Charles Bernstein doing in this book? Why is he here like again? This guy's everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
and it's true that it's Charles's it's not language. I would say this might be an offense to the other people in the movement, but it's mostly been him and Marjorie Perloff, who just passed away, right, a couple of days ago.
I would
She's very
say
sick.
this, which I found very, very important, because it is the amount of effort that these people, first of all Charles and also Marjorie, put in how nourish the connections with different people from different parts of the world. So from the 89 when we first connected, and then in 91 Charles and James Sherry were in Belgrade. They were invited in Vienna, and because we were also already in contact, Charles said, could we come to Belgrade? And then the war, it is just that the war will start in Yugoslavia, so they didn't go through Croatia, which usually they would go, but they go to Hungary, to Novi Sad and Belgrade. And it was, then I'll ask Charles. He told me that he will start in Buffalo to work, and I asked, is it any possibility that Mishko and I came, and I applied and got a small, I was poetic fellow at Buffalo. And then we have a time to conversation, and also he opened up for me. So every poet that I translated till that point, he contacted him and asked could they see us, and most of them we see. So it was a time when we managed to meet almost every poet that I translated, and I translated very much. So Marjorie Perloff also, they send their books, and they really was supportive. And I think in 90s it was a kind of a, how to say, because of the war and very dramatic feelings that most of our are feeling about this war. I suppose that this was a kind also of a political statement that I translate American poets, and they, whenever I translate, they send me books, and I was so, they actually give me material to work with and to go deep into the knowledge of what they were doing and of not just what they are doing, but for me it was also interesting that because they construct a kind of a canon, most of us who were dealing with language poetry actually start dealing with their canon. So for me, it was interesting when I see how some people from different parts of the world, especially from Russia or China, they are translating or writing. I say, oh my God, but that is because we are dealing with language poetry, so that's why we choose to deal with, for example, Zukovsky or Gertrude Stein or I don't know, many different poets or Austen, because, for example, I already said beat poets, everybody till today are fascinating this part of the world with the beat poets, and they're much translated. From the 90s in Slovenia, and I also saw in Poland, which could be connected with the fall of communism in both countries, and in Slovenia especially they become independent country. Interest, for example, from New York School at this point was from Slovenia important, and also I in some texts I saw also from they have in Poland some group that called themselves Oharists. In Slovenia, there are several poets. They were born the end of 60s, beginning of 70s. They are fascinated with New York School and Frank O'Hara and Ashbery. And when you read their poetry, you see that they actually are very much influenced by it. And if you see Slovenia, which is interesting for me, we are this global system, poetry system, in which New York School become very important. They rediscover young Shalamun, who was in contact and was in 71 in Iowa and wrote some poets very much under influence of New York School. And I remember, because some of these books were translated in Serbo-Croatian for us here. So, but we didn't know. I didn't know till recently how New York School was important for young Shalamun. When I read it, or when we read it, it was something unbelievable that it could be poetry, and it was so good. But many people, when wrote about him, the reference were usually beat poets, because they are known, their poetics and kind of writing, but this connection and this direct connection with New York School was hidden, and it is recently uncovered. But it is interesting how global tendencies have a function, and reception have a function on one level to the poetic work of a new generation of poets, and at the same time function to discover in your own culture a kind of work, because later Shalamun was eclectic postmodernism, but before that he was very much influenced by at the beginning of 70s, influenced by New York School. Yeah.
But for sure, especially for the kids, right? They're both interested in small press publishing. This is all like small press, right? Like even James Sherry, who Dubravka mentioned, right? Like who published the book. This is all. That's how language poetry began, right? Like they were writing stuff for a very small audience, and they were exchanging things with each other, right? I think Ron Silliman was in San Francisco, right? So they were sending each other books in the mail, right? So they had themselves sort of as an audience first, when the movement sort of, because it's not really a movement, right? If you think about it, it's not really, right? As they themselves, I don't think see it as a movement, right? They see it as like a collective of people that have shared interests, let's say, right? Shared, let's say, or shared interest in a particular kind of aesthetics, right? That was more, as you were saying, Dubravka, exploring, you know, why is this a poem, right? Like, why is this, very cluttered, disjointed, chaotic text? Why is this poetry, right? So I don't know. Let's, if you don't mind, Dubravka, let Ezra ask you a question. So it's
Yes, please.
been almost an hour, and then they haven't joined the conversation yet. So
My question was also about translation in language. So on page 161, you wrote, and I'm quoting, poetry as many languages. It may be written in a mother's tongue or in the dialectics, in foreign languages, second languages, third languages, ending quotes. And on the translation of this book, there's a note on how some of the poems were rewritten in English by the poets with the translator or vice versa. And I wanted to ask, what made you choose to do that rewriting of some poems? Did they have some particularity that somehow resisted the transition, as Bernstein's call it, to another language?
Ooh, okay. Right. For me, translation, as I said, is very, very important. Actually, what I think about when I think about my work, actually, by this huge amount of translation of language poetry, and I translate almost all of them. Almost all. For example, at the beginning, beside Charles, Lynn Hajinian was very important, and she was also the one who, for example, connected me with Arkady Dragomoshenko, and she sent me her books. And for me, it's very interesting when I discovered that interview that I made with her and published in one magazine in Novi Sad. She included in her book, I could not remember, Language of Inquiry. I think that the book is. For example, some of my colleagues who are teachers or think about themselves as a professional translator, and I think that I'm not professional translator. Translations are in the function of my own work at one level, and are in the function of getting the knowledge about one movement, language poetry, in this moment. And that, for example, I think that the omissions of errors that the translator, or I, the translator, do in translating from one language into another, I think they are, for me, they are not important, but most of my colleagues translators think that it is very, very important. Why it is not important? Because I don't think about translation as a separate thing that should be perfect in another language, whatever how you define the word perfect, but it is in a function that by translating one new model, you introduce into your own culture, into your own language, one model that, for example, is missing. With language poetry and my obsessive translation and writing about language poetry actually is that my translations, my writing of them, translations of their poetry and text, and my own poetry are actually the one, how to say, universe of my own work. And also, which is important, in 90s, I gathered a group of younger poets that we'd work on, and in our work, we establish a way of very, very complex poetry that have connections with the way how language poetry experiment function and how. So we localize. We're working with some of the ideas that theory is important, contemporary theory, post-structuralism, especially feminism, because we were working in one feminist organization, and feminism in former Yugoslavia, which I think is very important, with the fall of communism, and transformation. Now this is digression, but I think it's important. I have to map the political context. So when fall of communism happened, then feminism entered into these communist countries. And it entered usually within some activist organization and mostly within university discourse. But because of the war in former Yugoslavia, feminism in former Yugoslavia entered as a movement which was a part of a very complex anti-war and peace movement in Serbia, but also in other parts in Yugoslavia. So we were working in first in NGO or alternative academic institution, Center for Women's Studies in Belgrade. And then, because in one moment Center departed in university discourse and activists, and we stayed with activist branch, and it was called Association for Women's Asociacija za žensku inicijativu, for Women's Initiative. But I want to say that we are implicitly pretty much political, but we were dealing with politics at what is at the time, and including I mean language, poetry, discourse. It is politics of the form, not at the level. We didn't work with the level of the I don't know, narratives, but we were anti-narratives. And so language poetry was important to activate experiment in Serbia at the time when for almost 15 years experiment in former Yugoslavia didn't exist. And on the other side, it was important that it was connected with the whole spectrum of different cultural formations that were political in the sense that they are anti-war and anti-nationalistic. So it is part of this scene, which is important. I hope that I managed to answer. Thank you. And it is interesting for me that you, both of you, notice I was not so much aware of it, but it is obvious that Charles Bernstein was here very, very important, and I'm so much endowed to him, to James, to also Jerome Rothenberg. I also come to Rothenberg via Charles Bernstein, and Marjorie, I said, also Juliana Spar. It's interesting because while we were in Buffalo, we met her, etc. But when we returned to Serbia, she started inviting me, and she was also so supportive. And she sent her books of other interesting poets. So all of them were really, really want to contact with me, to be the contact in continuation. And Charles was the person that I asked him, could you send me the contact of this person? It is interesting for me. And he sent me, etc., etc. So that's why I think that it is very important, the effort that some people put into human interconnection transcontinentally.
Sure. Rita, do you want to go again? I feel that I've talked a lot. Like I haven't asked that many questions, but I've talked a lot, so maybe
Okay. Yeah. So I'm very interested in this connection between what might be considered difficult poems or in general difficult arts and politics, war, cataclysm, which of course is very relevant to the times we're living in, unfortunately. I have a poem of yours here, which was, I think it's in page 150. It's "Your eyes have deposited mud." In that poem, I noticed you draw a very, well, not only in that one, but that one specific, I noticed you draw a very clear line connecting experimental poetry, concrete poetry, visual poetry to politics. And you write about past lives of female workers, suffragettes, and I'm wondering if that connection, could that be that your poetry or experimental poetry contradicts a hegemonic poetic sensibility or a more conservative view of poetry?
Yes, actually, language poetry and my dealing with their work was, how to say, the trigger that made me possible that I work in my own context in this. So because in some cultures, you have a problem that you don't have a context to work within. And you have to make this context by your own efforts. So my context were references to visual art, but because I am all the time the poet, then I needed to make the context for my experimental work. So I work it with my translations, and I work also with a group of these young poets. They were, we read poetics, first of all, of American poets, but also Cubofuturism, Yugoslav Zenitism, Italian Futurism, and especially New American poetry, and then language poetry. And feminism was there because we were connected with feminist organization give us what I call safe space. So we work very far from the national poetry community. And I don't want to have any connection. And for a long period of time, we actually do it. I will say nobody knows that we are doing, but then they start publishing their first books in some important edition. Then in 2004, we made an anthology, and we enter into very intensive interaction. And this poem that you mentioned have some references to some poems that were written during our work in 90s. There is one poet that, or two of them mentioned in their poetry, suffragettes, or but when poem was written in Italy, I was in one how to say colony when many poets, Italian, but also one poet who is Russian but lives in Rome, or one then younger poet from Croatia who lived in and still lives in Trieste. And there are some younger performances that were at that time stars. They were Italian. They would some kind of dancing and very gestually reciting the poetry, like small theatrical pieces. And when I talk with them, they told me that in Italy there are two streams, one connected with poetry, the other, and they connected. So there is many references of the conversation that I in that group of mostly Italian poets, and some of them were women who were connected with Italian feminism, and also we talk about feminism. And many references from our conversation I actually put into the poems. So I connected the feminism which we as a group of poets work in Belgrade, and this different culture Italian with their ideas about, and I mentioned, because some of them mentioned Italian or American or French feminist theoretician. So I put almost every name that we are in our conversation mentioned. And in that poem, some Italian words were introduced into my original text.
Ezra, do you want to ask a second question? No? You don't? Okay. All right. I'll go with I'll actually just to continue talking about the importance that community plays in your work, right? Like one thing that I found very distinct about this book, very surprising, was the amount of footnotes that you've included, right? Many times to mark or to the flag, here this particular word refers to
Yes,
let's say the work of
yes,
this other person, right?
yes,
So it's very nice to you know you're reading the book, right? But it's just at the same time you're sort of getting acquainted with the work of all of these other people that are in your, I guess, in your orbit, right? And that you intentionally include, because these could very well have not been in the text,
yes.
right? That many times they're maybe not adding anything to the body of the text itself, but it's nice that you sort of make it a point to no, but this reminds me of this other person. And so it's a very nice also political, I think,
Yes,
gesture, right,
I'm
to
glad.
include.
I'm glad that you mentioned it, because Biljana, when she translated, from time to time, she added some footnote, and then I come to idea that actually I should not just for other people, but also for me, note, because I come from a very specific and almost unknown part of the world. So many poets that I'm referring to, I wanted by mentioning their names to pay my gratitude that I use their work. It is a kind of ritual to pay respect to some people. Some of them are less known, and some of them, it is also a kind, like language poetry made the canon of American poetry. Actually, I made the canon which refers to some of poets from Serbia, especially from Vojvodina, because Vojvodina was in socialism one of the most multicultural region of Yugoslavia, with Serbian, Croatian, Hungarian, Slovakians, Russians, and many others. and it's a very interesting mixture. And if Vojvodina was and still and actually is part of the Serbia, and in socialist time they have some kind of autonomy. And in Vojvodina, one of the most extreme experimental kind of poetry was written in Slovenia, something in Croatia, and Vojvodina. But their work are almost till very recently almost forgotten. And in Slovenia, there are so many interesting, they are most radical poets, not just Solomon, there are many of other poets that were in the same company, and some Croatian poets. And they're actually something that I construct as a canon for my work, and it is not just national, but Yugoslav transnational. And it is very, very reductive, because especially in Serbia, narrative poetry was till Ažin group, this young poet that worked with me, till that moment, narrative poetry was almost the only option. And yes, as earlier was mentioned, this kind of poetry was contextually constructed as opposed to the hegemonic narrative model. And for me, it was important to say about the places. I refer not just the people and their work, but also the places. And unfortunately, the only part of former Yugoslavia that was not here is Macedonia, because Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia were hegemonic cultures, and other cultures are later comer on the scene. But for a long period of time, from 80s, for example, Macedonian and also Bosnian and Herzegovinian poets become visible, which doesn't mean that good poets in this part are not existent, but these three were mostly, how to say, mostly visible.
Guys, I can go on forever, so please
Me too, so
jump in.
please.
I wanted to ask about the photographs that are included in a part of the book. I wanted to know if they are part of some performance that were related to the poems.
Yes. I have to say that I already say that I was in 80s connected with conceptual group 143, and they work in different medias, including performance art and photography and movies, etc., etc. And I must say that within Serbian history of art of this period, this group is not much treated, so it is almost not so much visible. But for me, they were important because thanks to them and my connection with them, I start to work something what will be, which I today call private performances. So as a poet, because there was a problem with that word, because they were artists and I came relatively late, and I in one moment start working with the performance in natural environments, and I have some photos, but there is no context for this kind of work, because it comes not out of the art, but out of the poetry. And I will also say what I always mention, in 80s, this kind of poetry, experimental poetry in Yugoslavia disappeared. And when Charles Bernstein and Jane Sherry came to Belgrade and Novi Sad, we presented their works, and they insisted that I, as a translator, read my translations. And it was for me very important because both of them start to using the voice as a medium. And I said, oh my God, this is so interesting. And I immediately start to imitate them, their manner of, and that was initial that I entered the performance poetry in a sense that I start working with my voice. Why this is important story? Because in my culture, in former Yugoslavia and in Serbia, there was one powerful artist, Katalin Ladic. She's from Vojvodina, Hungarian by ethnicity, but she was and still is a Yugoslav artist. She worked with a voice, but she was for me in my culture invisible. So I didn't come to this practice working with my voice through Katalin Ladic. I know about her, and many artists that I knew know her work, but she was not, my culture didn't give me her as a model. But James and Charles, when they work, I actually, our reading of their poetry was for me important to enter into the. And then after that experience, in I think 91 or 2, I start working a kind of dancing performances, but it was under influence of, for example, a kind of modern dance like Isidora Duncan and little bit postmodern poetry, but all, I mean postmodern dance, American, Justin Theater, and but also it was a problem because I, as a poet, start doing that, and I didn't have a context, and I work a little bit, but didn't have I think a social space, artistic space that I could develop that as a practice, and then I at some point quit it, and then again I don't know, maybe 10 years ago start to introduce some kind of narrative with the movement working. But the problem is when you in your own culture don't have a space, and now I think it is easier for poets and artists, performer artists, because some global scene is more, so you can travel, you can be invited in different spaces, and you can practice. But at the time in 90s and few years after 2000, for my generation, I was almost the only person at that moment. And as I mentioned, Katalin Ladic, it is important that she in 92 moved and lived in Budapest, and now she became very important, and she is recognized as important European artist. Many of her perform. She worked with her voice, sound poetry, phonetic poetry, and she was a professional artist, actress, and many of her work at that time you could find online, Katalin Ladic. Or because she's Hungarian, they said first Ladic Katalin, first surname. So it is a story how you try, but now everything is online, and you everything is available for artists and poets today. Thank you.
Wanted to ask a question. So let's see if I can pull it off. This is sort of a complicated question, like for myself as well. So I'm taking your as a sort of point of departure, your poem, "The Rule of Emptiness," after the war, which is on
Yeah.
page 180, and at some point you say, we wanted to resist politics. And then you sort of pose this rhetorical question, or maybe this was something that was asked to you, like, what are your political views? And you say, or it seems that you're responding, right? I am anxious because negative answers are unacceptable, right? And here we sort of arrive with a problem that I have personally with language poetry, right? Which is this, uh, you know, and here I'm just trying to be a little provocative. Or being facetious, right? So don't take me too serious. But the problem I have, right, is that again, like they sort of saw language, as you said, like a few minutes ago, right? Sort of, you didn't want to convey a message, right? Or you didn't want your poetry to have a narrative, let's say, or a punchline, right? It's more about form, right? It's more about using the page and using,
And concepts. I think that even maybe the more important are concepts than what you call form.
and that's great, because that's precisely what I want to what I want to, like, sort of explore, right? Is this resistance that I find, and I'm not saying, it's in your work, right? I don't think you deal with this at all, right? But there's a very strong resistance to, people that were influenced by language poetry, let's say, right? I don't know, both of my advisors, for example, right? Like, my advisor over here at Buffalo was a student of Marjorie Perloff, right? At Stanford, right? So he was very much influenced by language poetry. My advisor back in Portugal was a student of Charles, also here in Buffalo, right? So, but what's interesting to me is that precisely how resistant they are to conceptualism, right? And what you just said, right? Like, to concepts,
When you said
right?
conceptualism, what you mean? Concepts?
Well,
of-
no, what I mean by conceptualists are precisely the generation that came
the
after them,
next generation,
right? The following
conceptual
generation. So,
poetry.
yeah. So people that, for example, let me give you a very particular example, right? So I invited Charles when I was in Dublin for 2 years for a postdoc, and I invited him there for a conversation and a reading, and I brought up Vanessa Place, who I had on the show a couple of sessions ago, right? And Charles was like, I don't know, she got in big trouble, right? Dealing with the sorts of themes and topics that she was exploring or she is exploring in her poetry, because she's doing, or she's fooling around with material that is very sensitive, sorry, very sensitive, right? I mean, I showed the kids a couple of days ago.
Actually, in Montenegro just appeared one anthology that I made, anthology of American experimental poetry after 70s, and including most of my translations of language poetry, and I included some of conceptual, including her, so I know the work.
So I guess my question about, because I'm sort of riffing off of what you say in this poem about, like, a negative sort of politics, because that's what I find in language poetry, right? Language poetry, to me, right, is sort of a space where you can, like, experiment, right, with new concepts, new ideas, new formations, right, in terms of a collective, right? But then it's interesting that when you actually get down to, like, real political topics, a lot of people, no, and I'm not saying it's Charles or whatever, but a lot of people that have been influenced by this sort of negative politics don't want to touch on, like Vanessa Place does on rape, right? For example, right? Or which is a very serious thing, right? Of course, right? Even though her book is I'm referring to her book called Rape Jokes, right, in which she's provocatively like conflating these two things that are not really meant to go together, right? Like comedy and sexual violence or sexual assault, right? But the same thing sort of happened to, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Kenneth Goldsmith, right? Was sort of nowadays an outcast in the poetry community here in the States, right? And the reason, if you might be aware of this, is that he fooled around with police reports
I know,
of
I know.
the
I
Michael
read
Brown.
about that.
Yeah, the police brutality against African Americans, right? And so people were like, nah, this is not meant to be, this is not supposed to be in poetry, right? The poetry is not supposed to maybe, or if it is, right, if you go into these issues, you're supposed to have a very clear stance as to where you position yourself in relation to these topics, right? Which they don't, right? Neither Vanessa, right, or Goldsmith give you an answer, right, as to where you should stand, right? And this is interesting. It's just sorry, and I'll shut up and very, very in a moment, right? It's interesting because my advisor back in Portugal even thought Goldsmith was a fascist. Why and why? He's a fascist. I'm not going to engage with that sort of poetry, right? And why? Because it doesn't give you it doesn't tell you where it stands, right? It doesn't give you a sort of an answer as to like how you should position yourself in relation to whatever I'm narrating, right? So it's interesting that clash, the generational clash, right? I think, but also
You mean
aesthetic, right?
between language poetry and conceptual poetry, or
Yeah, and also the people that were influenced by
by them?
them, respectively, right? So I don't know. I mean, I guess this is not really a question, right? But I wanted you to maybe talk about this idea of the text as a negative space, right? And whether you think uh, I guess my question would be like, how far does this sort of aesthetics can take, uh, politics in the real world, right? Because that's criticism that is
Do you think
often
that it
leveled.
is also the position of language poetry? Because I think it is not.
No, I'm saying that. So one critique that is often leveled at language poetry, right, is that they were sort of fooling around with language, right, and sort of trying to, let's say, fool around with language and trying to create new things within the text, right? So the text was a space for experimentation, but then that doesn't really translate into actual like change in the real world, right? It's just as I sort of, and I'm nitpicking on this thing you say, right? Negative, because I think it's correct, right? Like it's a negative sort of politics, right? um but I like what I'm trying to sort of ask you is whether you think that this aesthetics then translates into like actual political change in the real world, right? Which you've sort of already said that it
I
does,
read.
right? But
I could not comment about conceptual poetry because I read a little bit about these scandals, and but I not go in deep, so I don't. I could not comment, but because for the 30 years I'm working on language poetry, I am of those who think that some kind of work you should think contextually. And if I think about their work and their what they call the politics of form, for example, or there is some other in some text of Charles or Beret-Wotten or Davidson. There is I think that we could think about the time where they formulated this kind of poetics, which have to do with some post-structuralist French theory, where the working with the text, you have or activate some subversive power. So I think that you or I will look at them as two levels of action, because most of them are left-oriented intellectuals. Most of them were part of the anti-war Vietnam protest. And I think even that connecting and supporting poets of different parts of the world is also, which are marginal, it is also part of this politics, so that some poets that belong to a culture that are globally invisible, maybe through their channels, their work or the part of the world could be visible. So I think that for me, it is interesting, because if you deal with some social problems explicitly in the poems, I don't know how this could change anything, especially in these days. And but what is happening, for example, and I think it is a global how to say, global tendency, a kind of return to hybrid forms, different hybrid forms of narrative. And for example, in this part of the world, we have many poets, especially relatively younger, who define them as feminist, and who in their poetry write against violence against women, or domestic violence, or political violence, against war and such. And I think it's interesting, but it is also one model that is now so pervasive that you don't have anything. It is a production, especially because now I think globally, I don't know if there are any epoch that so many poets, and especially women poets, are so many of them at the scene. And when I read it, I see very defined models. And if you don't narratively deal with these topics, you are not interesting. So I find it relatively problematic, because this new, I say, global narrative poetics, which is hybrid, actually expel everything that is this kind. It is I suppose counter backlash against this backlash. And for me it's interesting, because I read in last several years a lot of polemics with language poetry. But what is the fact for me? Whether authors, whether poets or theoreticians, criticize them or support their work, their work was so huge and so, how to say, important, that you could not avoid it. So whether people are against them or support them, you could not avoid. And I think that they are really most influential formation. And I don't know other cultures. For example, I have some book that deals with the experiment in France, but I think that for me it's interesting that in the United States, thanks to the very huge poetry culture and university that poets could teach, after Second World War, you have a continuation of experiment. And I'm fascinated with this fact, because in this part of the world, and I think as far as my not so well knowledge about different European poetry cultures, you don't have continuation, you have discontinuation. For example, you have when some experiment become globally important, you have in your culture experiments. But this was continuation, and this fact is for me fascination. I'm not sure what now is the situation. I suppose that many changes. Maybe you see this morning that small press distribution stop their work, and I see that or said that is not good for small presses in United States, but because they sell through small press. So I think that is a very bad news, and it says about current neoliberal treating with art, including poetry, which means it is not good news, and many of our poets today and yesterday said it's a very bad news.
I'll just very quickly respond to that, and I'll let the kids say, maybe ask a last question, because we've been here for a while. No, in Portugal, it's interesting that there is, and here Rita and Ezra might know a little bit more about this than I do. There is a strong, I think, culture of small press publishing, but I don't think, which is ironic. And this might be, and guys, don't be offended by this, please. Don't be, but the impression I have, right, is that most, and it's ironic, right? Most poetry is still really, as you would say, Dubravka, narrative oriented, image based. That's it. Yeah,
same here.
Although it's like small press publishing, and again, like, let's say, early career artists, etc. But they haven't really been influenced, let's say, by maybe the same kinds of aesthetic figures as you have, for example, or in my case, like I know that precisely because this my advisor in Coimbra, like, she brought all the stuff from language poetry to Coimbra. There is nowadays a very strong, like, creative writing tradition around the university, but whether or not that translates into like major publications, or like people being like as in your case, right, like someone that really like took the project of language poetry forward, let's say, in Portugal. I don't think that exists, right? There's people like myself, like, of course, I have been influenced by all of this stuff, right? But I'm not a poet. So, but I don't think that exists in the poetry scene. Maybe, and maybe you guys, Rita and Ezra, are maybe more familiar with what happened or what is happening today in terms of the art world in general, right? Which I'm less familiar with, right? Painting and video. I don't know, right? Like how progressive we are in Portugal when it comes to these sorts of media, right? But in poetry, unfortunately, yeah, it's which is why it's interesting that I have not had a single Portuguese poet in this show yet. And it's precisely because I just unfortunately don't like their poetry. It's just I don't like it. So that, anyway, I'll shut up, but otherwise I'll stop ranting again. So maybe Rita or Ezra, do you want to ask a final question, I guess? Or
Maybe Ezra
go on.
or I don't know if you have. I think we covered all my questions.
You too, Ezra? No. Then just the final one. Okay, we can just maybe talk about this Dubravka that you say on I believe that maybe the penultimate poem in the book. It's page 231, in which you say something very concerning, but also very interesting, which is that you think the ethnic, and I'm let's see if I'm quoting you correctly. Let's see. 231. Oh, I'm sorry. This is something you say in the interview, right? That you have at the end of the book, right? You say that it's the situation in Serbia, right, or in the Balkans, right, today is as concerning, as serious as it was in 91,
Yeah,
right?
the national tensions are also at the moment also very at climax. So I don't know what will happen. Not
and
good.
you add this. You also add this idea that the war in Ukraine has amplified these tensions, these ethnic tensions in the region.
Yes. The last poem I was invited one by Croatian poet Lana Derkac. She was making an anthology, and I for her wrote this poem, and I wrote that, and while I'm finishing the poem, the war started. And that war for me is very much a reference to our wars in 19. So it's really scaring, and everything is globally when you see the situation, too many points with the wars or potential for maybe some new wars. So situation is really bad. So my book tragically resonance with the contemporary global situation. When I wrote this, it was a local situation, but now it's scary.
It's interesting. I mean, it's not interesting. I mean, it's of course it's terrible, but it's curious that the same sort of like non-interventionist kind of politics that you saw during the Yugoslav war, right, is what you see today in Ukraine, right? In the sense that, oh yeah, we got nothing to do with it. It's the problem. And
I think it's a very, very complex situation on a very different levels have to do. When I think about that, I think maybe that even the situation in Yugoslavia prefigured many of the wars that are taking place today. So that's very complex connection in time, which maybe there is, but you could construct some parallels.
Yeah, so we'll see. And especially, I believe, and this like again, like we American poetry was very much at the center of our discussion today, and which is very curious because we're again, like you're a Serbian Serbo-Croatian, right, poet, and yet we've been talking about and it's interesting that the elections here in the United States might play a big role again in what happens in Ukraine and maybe in Eastern Europe, right? So it's the fate of the world will once again be sort of decided over here, which is it is what it is. It's not looking very good.
No, unfortunately. Unfortunately.
It's not, yeah, we'll see. Anyway, so thank you very much, everyone, and thank you especially to you, Dubravka, for joining us. And yeah, I'll see you next month. The next month we'll have let me just announce this. We will be talking to Joseph Kaplan, who is one of the post-conceptualist poets that I've been inviting over time. Yeah, and that's going to be on the 26th of April.
Great.
So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for
be with you because I really enjoyed, and thank you very much for inviting me and all questions that three of you are posing with the, how to say, deep understanding and of my work. So I really, really enjoyed, and it was for me important to have a conversation with you, three of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure reading the book as well, and you know, getting more acquainted with your work, which interestingly I only knew through Charles's recent books, which directly reference you and your work and conversations with you. So I kind of knew you from his work, which is interesting, right? So it's now, you know, nice to, um, it's nice that I've become acquainted with your project, and also as I said, the specificities of your political project and your aesthetics, and that was, it was very nice, very enriching
I
experience for
really
me, and I'm sure
enjoyed. I really enjoyed
yeah.
it. Really, really,
Yeah.
thank you.
All right, see you guys and have a good one.
See
Have a
you.
good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Day.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye bye.